You're listening to an Anazao Ministries podcast. How logical is sacrifice? And how much like Christ can a Vulcan or android really be? Well, today we're going to find out. We're going to be discussing Spock from the original Star Trek series, as well as Data from the Next Gen series. We don't do a ton of Star Trek, so this is really exciting, and we brought in some extra help for this one. Guys, this is Systematic Geekology. We are the Priesthood of Geeks. I'm Joshua Noel. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Whole Church podcast. I do a few other things, and hopefully you guys know me from here as well. I am joined today by the one and only Philadelphia's favorite, Joe Day.
What's up, everybody? I am so excited to finally get a chance to talk about Star Trek again. It's been a minute.
Oh, yeah. And she's been on an episode before, but not with us. So we welcome back the one and only Sari. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more to our audience? Because I don't dare try to pronounce your last name. I am terrible at Spanish.
Yeah, it's my my Panamanian spouse gave me the gift of a fun last name. So yeah, Sari Martin Concepcion. That's the name. Good to be back.
Stuff.
Good to be back. I'm glad we had to get rid of Will so that we could talk about Star Trek.
Yep. Yeah, Will is almost only Star Wars. Like I feel like if it was a scale, he's like 99% Star Wars. I'm probably next to him at like 80. And then you have Joe, and it sounds like you're more on like the pure Star Trek part of the scale, or closer to it.
Yeah, I mean, I watched the original movies when I was growing up, and I appreciated them. I don't dislike Star Wars in any way. It just doesn't really like do much for me. It doesn't move me in my heart, you know.
Yeah. My aunt, I just call her Annette. She listens occasionally, and she made me watch all the original ones when I was a kid. We'd go over to Kentucky for the summer. Uh-huh. There was no Wi-Fi or anything like that. It is Kentucky. They were the last to get the Wi-Fi and all that. So it was just, hey, what did she have on DVD? That's what we're watching while we're here. So I got Star Trek. Or it wasn't even DVD, it was VHS, but you know.
That's great.
Different times.
That's
times.
Great.
So guys, without further ado, let's jump into this. We are talking about two iconic characters in two iconic series, Spock and then Data. I feel like more people might be familiar with Spock than Data, but hopefully, if you're listening, you know both of these characters at least a little bit. Guys, how did you guys first come to know and love Star Trek? We're talking a little bit about that before the show, but Sari, do you want to take the ball on that first?
Yeah, sure. I'm right in the pocket for the age group that was the Next Generation, TNG, as we'll call it. I think we can go with the shorthand on this with this crowd. Mm-hmm. Grew up watching TNG, watching it with my dad on Sunday afternoons/evenings as it was airing. I'm not sure if I watched right from the beginning because that was like I was probably in kindergarten or something. But yeah, coming in probably a couple seasons in and watching it week after week. I was really attached to the characters. I feel like it was actually pretty formative for me in terms of like I was actually paying attention to like how leadership works, and I love the scenes where they were all sitting around the conference room table and everyone was giving their perspectives on a problem. And, you know, Picard would be like, yep, okay, nope, Worf, no. You know, and I love those scenes where everyone was bringing their expertise to the problem and just thinking about like, I think that would be my ideal like work scenarios, like being on the Enterprise D. And then, yeah, I came to the original series via the movies, probably. I think I saw the original series films before I kind of went back to the series and watched it and got more of the original, you know, it's only 3 seasons originally. But yeah, I've seen Star Trek the Motion Picture. Wrath of Khan is still one of my favorite movies. Search for Spock. Undiscovered Country, the whale movie, infamous the whale.
Yes.
I love that one, actually. And I remember seeing Star Trek 6 in the theater when I was a kid, and that's a great one too. It's the Undiscovered Country. So yeah, and then we talked about it a little bit, but didn't fall in love with Deep Space Nine when it originally aired, or Voyager. Kind of gave them a shot, but later on I revisited those series and really grew to appreciate.
Nice. Yeah, I guess I'm a little different coming to this game. I mentioned earlier, my aunt showed me all the old movies. The one that stuck out was the whale one. So many years later, I'm like, what was that movie where space people and whales were interacting? So I found that, and being a little bit older, there was enough missing pieces that I was like, So what's happening to Spock here? So I had to start watching them from the beginning to figure it out, and then I caught up on that, and I found out that I kept trying to watch Next Gen afterwards, and I was like, I just couldn't get past the second season. I just kept forgetting that I was watching it. But more recently, Lower Decks has come on Paramount Plus, and that has me just heads over heels, completely fallen in love with the whole Star Trek universe. I'm like, this is great stuff. So you could say the original movies, or you could say Lower Decks. They're both sort of my door into this. Joe, I know we've talked about it before on a different episode, but you remind everybody, how did you fall in love with Star Trek?
So I grew up a movie nerd. Movies have been a very significant part of my life for a long part of my life. And I grew up down the street from a movie rental place. And every month, at the beginning of the month, they would have these flyers that would show all of the upcoming, like all of the current releases, all of the upcoming releases, all of that kind of stuff. And I had heard, namely through one of my cousins who's a little bit older than me, that is a huge Star Trek fan. And so I had heard of Star Trek, and I think it was Insurrection was the first one that I saw of the TNG movies when it came out, and that was what introduced me for the first time. And I'm like, this is insane. And I had already been exposed to Star Wars, and like my true fandom for Star Wars is the original three. And I have a lot of those nostalgia ties and all of that kind of stuff. And so that was kind of my entry point. And when I started collecting series and movies and stuff like that myself, one of the first things that I picked up was Next Generation. And so that led into seeing I knew that there was an original series, but I had never seen it. And then I saw Wrath of Khan for the first time, which I actually my wife saw for the first time. And I saw again in theaters like a week ago. There's a company that's been doing classics and playing them in theaters, and that was cool. But and I went back and saw the original series and kind of went on from there. It's funny. As far as DS9 goes, I was saying before we went live that it was Will and Sari's episode that got me back into rewatching it and all of that. But I remember the first time that I watched it, I'd, again, been exposed to Star Trek by this point, and I was a huge wrestling nerd growing up, like a huge wrestling fan. And one of the shows was on UPN, which syndicated a lot of the Star Trek stuff, including DS9. And I remember watching, I just caught a random episode. And like you said, Sari, it's so, like, it is tonally different in a lot of ways from TNG and from the original series, that like when you're young and you're not like interested in the nuance of the story and the characters and all of that fun stuff, it's just kind of like, wait a minute, this isn't Star Trek, never mind. And as I got older and I appreciated nuanced storytelling, I went back, listened to it. I understand. I totally sound like a Star Trek like snob right now, but
I'm
it's
vibing
okay.
with it though. I'm totally getting it.
And I told you guys this earlier, but I've always been told that Deep Space Nine will be my favorite just because I'm a huge religion nerd. I like studying outside religions or fictional religions. I just think it's fascinating. I haven't got to it right now. The way I'm watching through Star Trek is probably the weirdest way possible. For those who don't know, Lower Decks is a cartoon, and it is somehow both canon and parody of Star Trek. So they'll get like a toy of one of the old ships and be like, oh man, this is the only good one, whatever. And they're like making fun of the fans that actually act this way. And what I've been doing is as I'm going through and they reference or make a joke about an episode from a different series, I'm like, well, I'm just going to go watch that episode real quick. So I've been kind of working through it in the oddest way possible. So that's just, that's what I'm doing. It's fun.
Whatever your entry point is, I think that's great.
Yeah. But I have been aware of Spock for much longer than Lower Decks, just because of my aunt and all of that. Joe, would you mind kind of filling in those who don't know? Who is Spock? What is his story? We talked about the Wrath of Khan a few times, which, just as a side note, having remembered the Whale movie first and then going back from the beginning and watching Wrath of Khan, you're like, oh, wait, is that why he did? And then you see him search for Spock. It's like, what?
first movie's notoriously not good, or not that good. You know?
I can skip the first movie.
Yeah, but like 2, 3, and 4, well, Star Trek movies, the even ones are always better for some reason. But 2, 3, and 4 work as a trilogy if you were to watch them through. And they all kind of go right back to back chronologically. So, and then 5 is pretty bad again. 6 is great.
I like all of the movies other than the first one. And sometimes I like them because they're bad. Yeah. Like the one, what was it? They find like a god or something.
And like it's Spock's brother that we didn't know.
I just thought it was
really,
so funny.
Spock has a brother that we just found out about in Star Trek 5. And then he has an adopted sister that we just found out about in Discovery.
Yep. It's totally normal. Yeah. Joe, who is Spock? What is this story that we're referencing in that movies 2, 3, and 4, that trilogy?
So Spock is a Vulcan, and Vulcans are logic-based, a logic-based race, and he is a part of Starfleet and is a member of the Enterprise crew, specifically playing largely against William Shatner, Captain Kirk. And it was funny. My wife and I were actually just earlier today, when I was telling her about the subject matter of today's episode, we were talking about that dichotomy of Jean-Luc and Data against Kirk and Spock, and kind of why it was so interesting when Spock and Jean-Luc met, because it was the two straight men that were meeting for the first time. But anyway, so he is a character that is has mixed heritage, human and Vulcan, but is most strongly identified as a Vulcan. And so you see him kind of go through this character arc, this progression, this story of what ends up becoming kind of like self-discovery, I guess, is a good way of putting it. But it's wrestling with kind of hitting this point of divorcing himself completely from emotion, completely from anything outside of logic, but also being put in these situations where he's faced and confronted with this idea of high emotional situation or things that break logic or something along those lines, and ultimately resulting in his sacrifice, his rebirth, those kinds of things. And you see, I for one, I will forever be an apologist for the first Star Trek movie. I think it's and I think part of that is I can appreciate an IP being exactly what it is and nothing more. That movie was an hour and a half long episode of like, if you want to show somebody this is what the original Star Trek is, that it's that movie. You know what I mean? In a lot of regards. So the whole V'ger thing, yeah, it's ridiculous. The guy from Seventh Heaven is ridiculous, but it is what it is. Yeah. But yeah, that his story beats really kick into high gear starting at Wrath of Khan and going through the next several movies. And that's kind of a aerial, overview version of who Spock is.
Yeah, one thing that I feel like you benefit if you do go back and watch the original series, which I feel like a lot of people don't, because the series itself has like the absolute worst effects anything has ever had, basically. but you do see Spock where he's wrestling with the fact that he's part human and part Vulcan, and he's supposed to be, because he's part of Vulcan culture, he's supposed to be completely logical and all that. And you see these moments here and there where he's realizing maybe emotion's not the worst thing here. Maybe this part of my humanity is okay. And then it comes to this point where he realizes the logical thing is to sacrifice himself for the good of everyone. And because of that, when he does come back to life, which that's a whole thing in of itself, he basically is reset and it's back to all logic, and he's having to rediscover those humanity parts in the movies, which are at least produced a little bit better. So I feel like it's more palatable for people then at that point. I think that might be why they did that. But yeah, Spock. I love Spock. I particularly love in the Whale movie, they go back in time. They're in San Francisco, and he tries to mimic doing the strong language because he's told that's what people do here. And he just says it at the most, like, nonsensical parts of the sentence that just makes it sound so dumb. Plus, he's being logical. He's not, like, getting emotional and angry and yelling swear words. He's like, yeah, this word. Isn't that right? It's like, that's not how you do it, Spock. It's just weird, but great. Sari, did you have anything you wanted to add about Spock's character, storyline, any of that?
No, it's a pretty good summary. I think what I like about the original series and the movies and stuff is, like, when you would see a break. So Vulcans have emotions; they repress them. That's their, like, cultural way of being. But he would break a little, and his half human. I think he's compensating for the half human part of him. You know, choosing to excel as a Vulcan, but living among humans all the time. What was I going to say? But he would break kind of so rarely that when it happened, it was really special and it really caught your attention. Yeah. You know, there's one part in the original series where he thinks that Captain Kirk has died, and then he sees him alive and he breaks and he's like, Jim! And it's just, like, so touching. That's all he has to say. Like, get a little excited for a split second and you just feel it. You're like, oh man, their friendship is powerful, you know? I feel like they get a little bit like Spock's breaking all the time, and he's like, I don't know, we don't have to get into the J.J. Abrams movies, whatever, but, like, I feel like they overdo that a little bit to where it's not as special anymore, you know, because he's like, oh, he's always struggling with his emotions, you know, constantly. But anyway, that's just a little bit of critique, but yeah, I really love that aspect of him.
So they're different sides of the coin of trying to figure out what this whole, like, existence thing is of, like, how to be, you know, one's trying to shut off the emotion, the other one's trying to find it. And it's when you're playing in that kind of sandbox, it becomes it kind of shines a natural light on those moments, you know, not to dog any part. I love hearing different, especially with Star Trek. I love hearing people's origin stories to getting into the IP, because it's so, it does, Star Wars does cast a looming shadow. So it's always nice to hear those stories. So, like, I'm not trying to dog on any particular, you know, aspect of Star Trek, but it is an interesting thing to note about both of these characters, that's kind of what ended up becoming of the character in the hands of certain people.
Data, yeah, these aren't spoilers. Okay, Data and this is like 30, 40 years old, whatever.
Right.
Data and Spock both have trajectories in their characters that end with sacrifice. And I think that has to do a lot with what sort of, like, their whole thing is understanding what it means to be human. And it's making a statement that the ultimate expression of humanness is sacrificial love, which, yes, of course it evokes Christological things.
Kind of makes me think of that Bible verse of greater love is there's no greater love than giving up your life for a friend, kind of deal. And that's exactly what we see here. You mentioned Data also ends in sacrifice. So I'm going to throw this one to you. Same question. Who is Data? What is his, you know, general, you know, skyline view story? What is his story?
Data's Pinocchio. He was created kind of like by a mad scientist, and on a very remote planet, where a disaster happened and everyone was killed by the crystalline entity. And Data's found just as he's an android. He's a very advanced AI, and so they wake him up and start, you know, talking to him and stuff, and he's like the best example of artificial intelligence they'd ever seen, and with all the markers to make him as human as possible. But what he's lacking is emotions. He doesn't have human emotions. So anyway, he ends up joining Starfleet, and there's some of the best episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation are about Data. There's a really powerful episode early on that's like, it's probably the chief, if you want to know what a Star Trek fan is like, it's someone who loves the episode where Data's human rights are on trial. And it's just like, you know, it's like a court case at a space station deciding whether or not Data should get human rights. And like, that's so boring, right? But it's not. It's amazing.
Yeah.
See, that's super interesting.
Super interesting.
I don't feel like it.
So that's what Star Trek is, right? It's just like taking a strange ethical, or not strange, just taking ethical issues and let's talk about them in outer space in these different scenarios. So yeah, so Data does get more complex, and I think he's very innocent and naive, and he gets a little bit more sophisticated as the series go on. And then in the TNG films, he gets an emotion chip where he ends up being able to acquire human emotions as well. And then I don't think it's a spoiler to let everyone know that we lose him in Nemesis, which a lot of people, I kind of feel a little bit about that as I do about that J.J. Abrams Wrath of Khan mix and match. It's like, it feels like I guess, I don't know. It just felt like, oh, they're doing the same thing as they did with Spock in Wrath of Khan. Like, he has to sacrifice himself to save her. But I don't know. Maybe it's just like that movie's just kind of okay, So it's kind of a bummer that he went out on that note. However, quickly, sorry. He does feature prominently on the new Picard series through, if you haven't seen that, it's like his consciousness is accessed. So there's a little bit more to his story there. On the first season, just the first season, it was just going to be the first season.
Yeah, I feel like how a lot of people feel about some of the other materials that have been coming out. I feel like that's where I'm at with Picard. Like, I know, and that's cool that they brought back Data for like an interesting plot point, but like everything they do with him is garbage sauce. Just come on, you know what I mean? Like that was I've got a lot of opinions.
I didn't feel like, they definitely had this mentorship, friendship connection, but it wasn't like Kirk and Spock. It was different than the Kirk and Spock relationship, but they're treating it like it was the Kirk and Spock dynamic,
right?
Where TNG was more ensemble. The individual relationships are, it's different. I just didn't feel the same way about it as I did it. And they're acting like that's what it was. And also the writing wasn't
right. The original series lived and died on personality and like that, like individual relationships and like really falling on necessary plot points to push forward a show like that at that period of time when it was being created, right? With TNG, you almost got the vibe that the entire thing was a living organism. Like the entire Enterprise crew was one giant group and every part had their piece and all of that kind of stuff, which was actually a very interesting piece that I gleaned off of it when I watched it with my wife a couple of years ago. It was the first time I watched it since becoming a Christian. And I was like, man, this is very like, there's kingdom notes in this. There's community notes in this, all of that kind of stuff, but made by the hand of, a historically staunch atheist. But I mean, when you try and pull out an individual relationship like that and to say that it was more emotionally driven and that aspect of it, like, no, if you watch, Data kind of always looked to to Jean-Luc as almost like a paragon of humanity. Right? Like a paragon of courage and somebody that like, if I am looking to what a human is to look up to, right? This is a role model, if you will. That was always more of the relationship between those two, not so much buddy. And I feel like they really tried to exploit that in an effort to get over a subpar storyline in general. You know what I mean? Sorry to all of you Picard fans that are out there. I mean, like, just totally dump on it. But it's just, if I'm going to look at an aspect of Star Trek writing and say, this is just nostalgia bait, I've got to, you know what I mean? Like that.
Yeah, and they just put out the teaser for the next season, and everybody's in it. It's got, Beverly's in it, Troy's in it, Worf's in it.
There was a season of South Park where they were making fun of the J.J. Abrams remaking all these different movies because it was around that time. And they had the member berries. Yep. Everybody's just feeding member berries. We just like, remember? And that sounds like exactly what that is.
I have a thing of like, if you would have gone back in time and said to J.J. Abrams, look, you can have Star Wars or you can have Star Trek. Which one you want? He 100% would have said Star Wars. I think he's he's 1,000% a Star Wars fan, and that's like where his aesthetic really is strong. Who should have gotten a reboot for Star Trek? I think that would be a fun conversation to have with some fans. Like if you were going to take a contemporary filmmaker and say, "Oh, you get to reboot the franchise," you know? Like I think
Tim Burton. Here we go.
Imagine such a thing.
Whole new series.
I kind of like Joss Whedon. Like I wouldn't do that.
That would be.
I think
cool.
He would have done a good job. But
there's a lot more color to it. I feel like.
But I wanted to say something about Spock and Data because there's a couple ways that I like to pull meaning from a text, a show, whatever. And one of them is just the experience that you have of the show. And I think that's really valid. And something that makes those characters so popular and appealing is because they're insiders, but they're outsiders. You know, they're like, they are part of the group, but they also don't really fit in. And they're sort of looking at humanity in this sort of National Geographic kind of, how can I study the behavior of creatures who are my friends, but also like I don't really fit in. And I think a lot of fans, like myself, can kind of relate to that experience of feeling like an outsider. And the way that, you know, it's not like people are mean to them or rude to them or whatever. They are continuously like brought into the group, but they always have those moments of like, oh, I'm not like everyone else here. And I felt like I could relate to that, you know, like I felt, you know, when you feel kind of like a misfit in your social spheres and I think that, if we're going to listen to kind of, you know, Gene Roddenberry as a creator and who's an atheist, making a beautiful kingdom of God like vision of the future, but without religion, I think that we can, if we're going to be humble about it, can take the critique that oftentimes the church has not been good at inclusion. And that is something that a lot of us could work on. And I think that is also part of, like, Jesus is always challenging that, right? He's saying to the religious leaders, look, you're too busy building hierarchies, and I'm busy challenging who's in and who's out when you're trying to create more ways to figure out who's in and who's out. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Francis Chan writes a book, Erasing Hell, which when I read it, one of the most fascinating things that he includes in there is he makes the statement of showing where all Jesus talks about hell and who he's talking about it to. And Jesus almost exclusively talks about hell to religious leaders and rich people. He's like, yeah, you notice Jesus doesn't mention it to the sinners and the poor people and the downtrodden. He teaches them hope. You know, the people who think they got it figured out and are all full of themselves. That's when he's like, yeah, no.
Yeah. One of my favorite aspects of, I remember the first time that I told a Christian that one of my favorite creative directors for TV is Gene Roddenberry. And they knew who I was talking about when I said that. And I've only been a Christian for 5 years. I'm one of the elder statesmen age-wise, but a pup in comparison to some of our other hosts when it comes to time served. But for me, I process something like a Star Trek, and I can appreciate as an individual and as a Christian, this idea of looking to a better tomorrow where we stop trying to focus on the individual and we focus on advancing. We're not focusing on war. We're focusing on advancing as a society, peace, those kinds of things, pursuing the scientific, all of those kinds of things, right? And to me, I think that it is sometimes more powerful to watch something made from an atheist that still makes these notes, that still can produce something that looks and smells so similar to what the book of Matthew is talking about when he talks about Christ as the king, and talk about the kingdom and the influence and ripple effects of Jesus and exposure to Jesus. And you look at somebody like C.S. Lewis, right? We are in the midst of the year of Lewis. And I walked with a bunch of the different hosts through this review of the Narniad because I'm a huge Narnia nerd. I love Narnia. And it's really cool to watch the way that he was able to interweave throughout this entire narrative reflections of truth. But we need to stop and consider the fact that a staunch atheist also was able to create reflections of truth, that it didn't have to come from the source of it being a Christian, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we are looking at this objectively, and if as the individual, right, there's this dichotomy of we are citizens of the kingdom of God, but we are also individuals that live on earth. And while, I don't know, we need to not look to the government to legislate our beliefs and all of those kinds of things. There's a lot of ground to cover between like going overboard and still like being an active participant in the world and stuff like that. And like how we interact with people and how we do these things and how we work out this thing called life. And for me, I'll speak individually, but I think, Sari, you'll vibe with this. For me, I am always a sucker for a story that tells the vision of a better tomorrow, and also is one that is willing to be honest about what it takes there, about the realities of the situation. Like, yes, there's fantasy. It's sci-fi. I get it. I understand there's aliens. There's all kinds of things, right? But this is really one of those IPs that I think if we take the time to allow for the story beats to wash over you, these are some of the core questions that we should be asking as Christians of how is it that we create and foster a society where everybody can flourish, where everybody can, it so is baked into this idea of what does it mean to actually lead with love, right? So often we hear, love the sinner, hate the sin. Okay, I'm down with that. I'm good with love the sinner, hate the sin. I am. If we actually do that, you know what I mean? Like if that's actually what we're doing, then aces, fantastic, right? And I think if we can get over our ego, or this irrational fear that if we listen to something made by an atheist, we're all suddenly going to catch the atheist, right? Like, and just accept that this is the valuable lessons. I challenge any other IP to stand up to Star Trek with just the sheer magnitude of the lessons that could be learned from, take your pick, Baskin Robbins. There's 52 different flavors of Star Trek to be had. You can pick your flavor. And I still think that same statement holds up. All right. Now I'll get out the pulpit. My bad.
It's just a shame that you have your mic on a mic stand, so you can't actually drop the mic. Man, there's so much that both of you got at there that I kind of wanted to go back to. Sari mentioned that it is this kingdom world that you were both talking about, but without religion. And to me, it's like they replaced what we would envision, the kingdom in heaven looking like. Instead of God and religion, they replaced it with logic. That is his highest principle. That's why we see the savior characters of Spock and Data being the most logical people. And yet, Gene Roddenberry challenges his own stance on that. Throughout it, he's challenging, okay, but when is humanity, when is the emotion actually trump this logic that I hold so dear? And that's one thing that I think really makes him great, is that he does have this belief that a more logical, a more science-based world will be a better world, but he's not afraid to challenge that all throughout these series. And that's one thing that I wish more people would do. Show your own belief and then challenge the heck out of it all the way through what you're doing. That's phenomenal. We tiptoed around this a lot. It is a picture of what the kingdom could look like. We have these two characters, both of their stories end in sacrifice. And Joe, you mentioned, even though he's not a Christian, he's painting a great reflection of truth. And here's where this is part of a rant that I want to go on when we finally do Is Superman a Christ Figure? I want to do that episode so bad. I've been trying to do it since the beginning, for a year now. I want to describe a little bit what we mean when we talk about a Christ figure, and then posit to you guys, can a character be a Christ figure if the creator did not intend them to be a Christ figure. Because a Christ figure is more of a motif. It's not necessarily about motive. It's not this person was trying to show Christ. The motif goes, there is a person with either special abilities, can work miracles, is especially good in some way. That person makes a sacrifice for everyone or for a group of people and then comes back. Now, with Picard, maybe you can say Data comes back. Maybe Data fits that bill. But I feel like Spock has a really clear picture to me where I see like it looks like a Christ figure. I don't know if we want to call it that because the creator didn't intend that. But it still looks like this thing where you have this character who's especially good, who's especially helping everyone with, his powers of logic, the greatest principle of Star Trek, sort of. And yet he decides the most logical thing to do in a situation is to sacrifice. And then he comes back to life. And that's where I'm like, that seems like it has all the right elements. Does it count? Joe, I'm going to give Sari time to think about it. Does it count?
So I'm gonna sum up what I would say in just a simple statement. Truth is truth regardless. And I think when it's a reflection of truth, it's a reflection of truth. Now, there really is a bridge too far when you start to get into this whole Christ figure thing, because you're right. It has become more about a motif than anything else. A person dies heroically and then comes back and suddenly they're a Christ figure. But there are some times I absolutely disagree that this qualifies for Data, partially because, again, I'm salty about all of that. I don't
know what happened. So.
Yeah. But I would say out of the two of them, the one that hits more of the notes is Spock, because he does something that is illogical, and he does something that breaks the paradigm by sacrificing himself to save everybody, right? In a move that is very clearly motivated. That has very clear motives to it. It's not just that heroic beat. But again, I think there's nuance. I'm not sure that the nuance lies in whether or not the artist intended for it to be an allegory, but I do think that there is nuance between what is a hero and what is actually a Christ-like figure.
Yeah. Now, C.S. Lewis wasn't talking about Christ figures, but he did at one point say that in every human, there is this desire to know God. So we should not be surprised in any story if something that imitates or reflects the truth is there, because that desire to know God is somewhere deep within all of us. So even if it's unintentional, I could see it slipping out as just part of what it means to be human. I don't know. It's choppy waters. Sari, what say ye?
I have a few points to make on this topic. And
all right.
Take no offense. I think my first thought is that in a more vague sense, the pattern of life, death, rebirth is in literature for almost all of human history, and that Christ is like the as the Christian example of that in this very pure form. Whatever. I'm not going to go deep. I don't want to go deep into Christology. That's not my point. So yeah, like God's truth being just baked into us as the image of God and nature is a reality. So yes, echoes of that everywhere. That said, I'm pretty critical of the Christian impulse to search for Christ figures in literature.
Yep.
I don't love it, and I don't. And this is going to bring together a couple points that I made earlier. I think for one, searching in a text for author intent is important. And I think it's also Christian because it's generous listening to what is the culture saying. Maybe not just this author, but this is born out of the spirit of the time that it was in. So I think it's just generous listening to culture and to what the author is saying. And I think that is kind of a more responsible framing for searching for meaning. And then third is that thing I alluded to earlier also, which is it's okay to find meaning in your experience of a text also. And that could include, especially if you're a Christian, like Christological, like, oh, this, I feel like this story, even though it wasn't the author's intent, maybe taught me something about Jesus. Like, even though that wasn't, like, if that's how you experience it, I think that's pretty valid. Like, that's okay. Like, to have stuff like Star Trek, like, inform your faith, I think that's actually fine, So yeah, and like I said earlier, like, I experienced Star Trek as, like, I feel like it helped teach me things about how to be a good leader and how to be a good friend and all that stuff. So anyway, that's where I'm at with that whole thing.
Yeah. I have multiple answers to this. First and foremost, I think Christ figure is the absolute worst title we could have given the motif. The motif just needs a different name. I mean, you could even call it seasonal motif. Nature itself just does this every year where, we see trees die and come back again. That is just the way of life. That is nothing particularly special. Now, I do think if we're looking at like Old Testament, thinking like Moses, Joseph, Daniel, those kind of characters, they were not intended to be Christ figures by the author necessarily, but I do think their stories reflect Christ intentionally. But that's a different time. I think for this, we could just let stories speak about sacrifice without having to make it about Jesus as sacrificed. And one thing, we've kind of went both ways on this so far, but I want to push back on the idea that it was illogical for them to sacrifice. Because I think in both instances of Spock and Data, I think it might have actually been the most logical thing to do. Spock saved more lives by sacrificing.
Well, yeah, I think that ultimately, he said the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Like, that was the logical axiom that was guiding his decision. I'm just one person, and it's going to save a bunch of people, so I'm going to sacrifice myself. And I think that maybe there's an implicit idea that maybe if he didn't have suppressed emotions, that the emotions might get in the way of making that decision. That's possible. But, I mean, it's obviously, I think, like, modern psychology, I'm not a psychologist, but has found that it's not like you can clearly separate feelings, instincts from thoughts. Like, this isn't an easy thing. Like, I think there was a thing, like, maybe, there was a time, like modernism, right? Like, that science is going to fix everything. With our minds and our reasoning, we can fix everything. But now we know that that's just not the case. And that's like you can't so cleanly separate all these parts of being human.
Right.
The Star Trek does it to kind of paint a picture, like kind of just, the TV shows use extremes to like teach us things,
Oh yeah.
But
that's the funnest
yeah,
story.
exactly. I mean, I grew up in a tradition that was very intellectual and very like theology emphasizing and like kind of taught that the emotions were strictly bad, but as an adult and someone who's been to therapy, you kind of learn that your mind can, you can talk yourself into all sorts of lies, right? And and they seem very logical and like they make a lot of sense. And sometimes your gut and your feelings can be signals of good things, of things that are deeper truths that you need to think through, And also that even kind of you can't so cleanly separate them. So.
Oh yeah, it's kind of funny. I grew up almost the opposite, growing up Pentecostal. Kind of everything was spirit, emotion. Yeah. So once I went to college and started studying the Bible and hermeneutics and that kind of stuff, I'm like, wait a minute, there's a whole logic level of this. This is awesome. So yeah, like you said, I mean, you can't separate the bunch. I definitely overcorrected and had to come back a little bit over the years. And
yeah. That's the way, right?
So I want to go back to the original point that was made. I want to echo what both of you guys said. Like, reflections are true. Reflections of truth are different than ham-fisting Christ, and that's where I think that the bridge too far is. Right when we try, and thank you, Sari, for putting nuanced lyrics to what it was that I was trying to say, but about the searching for Christ in everything, right? Because some stories just don't have a Christ allegory, and that's okay. I promise that's okay. and like, we can see proof text of truth and this and that, and like that's its own conversation. And allowing for stories, allowing for your faith to impact how you process things is cool. Like, aces, fantastic. But when we 100% ignore the artist to read our own narrative into it, yeah, I mean, that's disrespectful to the artist, right? Like the artist meant for something to be taken out of this. An artist was trying to convey something, regardless of whether or not they did it well, regardless of whether or not that's your bag, regardless of any of that kind of stuff, your own personality aside, the artist was trying to do something with their art. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree that, especially with things that allow for more, conversation about things like ethics, pushing the parameters of what it means to exist, pushing the parameters of how to human, right? When literally you have characters in these series that are trying to figure out how to human, right? It invites a lot of that opposition of, well, I have to look, what if I don't find Christ in this and all of that, right? And I'm not trying to like make fun of certain types of Star Trek fans, but there's just a reality to this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like, to me, my opinion of Star Trek is that if you allow the stories to speak for themselves, that's when you get maximum impact, right? Sari, I cannot believe that you referenced that one particular episode, but you hit it dead on the money. If you want to know what brings us the most common type of Star Trek fan to the yard, watch that episode. That
it's
episode
called Measure of a Man is what it's called.
It is.
Measure of a Man.
I was about to say that. I looked it up because you mentioned it. I'm like, now I have to watch that.
I just want to say one more thing on the Christ figure thing is that when Christians say that on the Christian impulse to find Christ and everything, it's too tied to me too. One of my little pet peeves too is just to Christ's death and resurrection, and doesn't like and ignore some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, which is the message of Christ's life and teachings, like the Sermon on the Mount stuff. Like when we talk about finding Christ and stuff, we're talking about finding a character that dies and resurrects, or something like that, and that brings too much focus on just that one thing and not all the stuff before that. You know?
Yeah.
On that note, I remember the first time that I said to somebody that you can talk about the kingdom without using the words death, burial, or resurrection. Oh, I was 7 different shades of heretic. I absolutely was in that moment. I might as well have a pitchfork in my hand, because you need to understand at the beginning of Matthew 5, it says, and Jesus taught them. Okay. So you're talking about like Jesus, right? The one that the one that we are supposed to be following. And he taught, well, maybe we should shut up and listen to what he's actually teaching, and then understand that that's what he's doing. He's teaching, he's informing. And that when you understand that, yes, there is an aspect of this, that we are sinners in need of grace, all of that kind of stuff, right? That the significance of that. Yes, absolutely. But then that's that. If you understand that that's sentence 1, line 1, page 1 of the story of how you work this out matters. How you live this out matters. The impact that being a citizen of the kingdom of God matters. And I think if you allow for it, allowing a secularist to tell a story that involves some of those notes can be some of the most impactful media that you can allow to take to wash over you, you know?
Well, I was going to say that you guys teed me up perfectly to talk about something I mentioned earlier, my love of hermeneutics. And then we went away from it. So now I'm going to backtrack so that I can talk about my love of hermeneutics. Because what you were getting at is this whole idea that we're trying to shove Christ into the story. And this is one of the biggest principles that changed everything for me, and it just really irritates me how often I see other people do it. There's this thing, eisegesis, which is just a fallacy of how you read a text. And then there's exegesis, which is how you should read a biblical text or anything. I see this applies just across the board generally. Eisegesis is what you're doing when you're doing, let's put Jesus into this story. You're wanting that there. You're putting it in that. That's eisegesis. You're putting something into it. Exegesis is you take what the story is saying, you take it out, and then you do something with what it was saying. So in this instance, I think what you can do is you can see that these stories are showing that I think the ultimate end to humanity, the most human thing you can do is sacrifice. And also, it is logical. I think it shows both of those things at the same time. And I could take that truth about sacrifice, leave the story, and then apply it to other things. And it's actually how Star Trek has taught me a lot more about God and Jesus. I forget God invented logic. And when I think about that, and I think about what Jesus did, wasn't just he so loved the world, it was actually the most logical thing to do. He sacrificed one who will come back again to save everybody. Numbers-wise? Wow, that adds up. You know what I mean? Like, wow, that makes so much sense. And I feel like instead of shoving Jesus into the story, so we can be like, oh, look, Jesus is everywhere, we could take that out and learn something new about Jesus. And as a Christian, I think I'd rather learn something new about Jesus than shove him somewhere that he wasn't supposed to be in the first place. So, in a way, it reminds me of the big debate. A lot of people were talking about when the song Reckless Love came out. And it was, oh, God's not reckless. He decided whatever. And what if it's both? What if Jesus was fully human? And, that in a way, yeah, reckless. That was, you just give up yourself for no reason. And also incredibly logical. It's both. Wow. That both and thing. I'm sounding more Lutheran by the day because of Will. Yeah. What are some other characters they should check out when we're talking about these cold, logical characters before we move on?
Well, yeah, I was thinking about this for Deep Space Nine because probably the least easy. Deep Space Nine has a fun kind of band of misfits vibe to it. There's a lot, but Odo is the closest thing. He's the most like of that outsider vibe, and but I was thinking about his emotional life, and he kind of reminds me more of Bones than Spock in a lot of ways. But
interesting.
But anyway, he's a really interesting character and has a really interesting arc on the show. So I think he'd do. If I had to pick one, he'd be the one. Voyager has a Vulcan, Tuvok, so he kind of fits that archetype pretty easily. But then later on, they get 7 of 9, who's a Borg. So she's another one, which is kind of interesting, like to have a female.
Borg are so interesting.
Yeah. Which Janeway has no problem defeating the Borg. So that's fun. What else is there? Oh, there's Enterprise. I don't know that series as well. I've watched some of it, but they also have a Vulcan as part of the crew, to Paul. Yeah. So it's that bill there.
Cool. If you had to pick one that people should check out other than Spock and Data, what's another character you think people should get to know?
I would go Odo. Yeah, I would go. Yeah.
Odo?
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. I will look into Odo because I don't know that one yet.
Really interesting storyline. He's a shapeshifter.
I love shapeshifters.
Yeah.
I can't wait for the Skrull to enter the MCU. Like, they're there, but they're not prevalent yet. They're about to be prevalent. It's going to be great.
So Odo is a good shout. The one name that wasn't on that list that I have to throw out there is Worf. He hits it from a different angle, being from the war culture, and the test of your worth is your valor and your strength, and those are the whether or not you very much based off of what is most commonly associated with Vulcan or Viking culture, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and he's got the bicultural identity too, because he was raised by humans,
right?
On Earth, because he was found as a war orphan, but he very much wants to be in touch with his Klingon heritage, but works in Starfleet. So yeah, that's a great one.
And he starts off as just this kind of in the background, right? The big thing was that he was a Klingon, and a Klingon was on the ship, and all of that kind of stuff. And that was enough at first to make him set apart. And then they started building on his character, and they started going into his backstory and all of that kind of stuff. And some of the more, some of the first long form storytelling that TNG does is centered around Worf and unpacking his character and really the Klingons as a whole for the first time, where they weren't the big enemy and all of that. And so for me, I love the idea of showcasing a guy that has, that is driven to prove himself and comes from that culture of being told that, and then figures out how do I play in the sandbox with other people? How do I develop relationships? How do I start to evaluate myself on different standards, but while also accepting the positives that come from the upbringing and the culture and all of those kinds of things. That, for me personally, was one of the first real resonant story beats that I recognized and I was drawn to in Star Trek.
Yeah, the story beats with the Klingons of the original movies, just how that evolved, super fascinating to me. So as I'm getting into some of the other Star Trek newer stuff and seeing them just around, I'm like, I'm still getting used to it because the movies were like my original reference point. And it's, I don't know, it's really fascinating just to see that interaction of, this has been normalized. At some point, Klingons have been normalized. And then getting to have that, and now the Strange New Worlds going back to the time before it was normalized. I'm fascinated to see what they do with that as that show goes on. That'll be pretty interesting. But, well, that being said, I think it is time for our wrap-up. We had a lot of fun, kind of a longer episode, but these were two incredibly deep characters with a lot of incredibly deep themes, so it's kind of to be expected. One thing we like to do, Sari, as we wrap up, is just give a general recommendation of something people could watch, read, anything like that. I'll go first. You should read Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, particularly because I've been rereading it, and it is just incredibly complex, amazing book. And we're going to be doing a what if episode of if Disney made Les Miserables. So that'll be fun. If you guys just want to do prep beforehand, it's like a few thousand pages. It's great. Joe, you have any recommendations for us today?
Yeah, so I want to I'm going to simultaneously give a recommendation and also give a shout out to an awesome artist that I met over the summer. Her name is Emily Swan. She illustrates for independently, but she illustrates like Shakespeare, Jane Austen novels, stuff like that. She's taking kind of famous literature and turning it into different graphic novel works and things like that. And so it is really cool to take a look at just a different way to tell these stories with different like emphasis and different things like that. I think is pretty cool. So that's what I've been geeking out on.
All right, Sari, what you got for everybody?
I didn't think about this too much ahead of time, so I'll go ahead and go with well, have you guys tell me if this one's been said before? Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Ever heard of it? Okay, I read this earlier this year. If you are an Inklings kind of person, you will like this book.
Hey.
All right. The author's name is Susanna Clarke, and she's very much, the writing style is operating very much in the tradition of that writing, the British, kind of tone to it. But it came out, I think, last year. Piranesi, Piranesi. A great novel. It's a pretty quick read, and I highly recommend it.
So I got a new novel and Star Trek episode I got to do right after this. Guys, if you enjoyed this episode, you can always go back over to systematicgeekology.org. They got a drop-down menu where it says host. We have Joe and my name. Both will be on there. You can see everything that we do. And Sari, where can they go to see other stuff that you've been working on and you do outside of these two episodes?
Totally. Let's go with my art stuff, and my filmmaking stuff is on a website called secretartproject.com. Secretartproject.com. And my work life is having to do with Christians engaging the sciences, and especially the psychological sciences. That's a nonprofit I work for. It's called Blueprint 1543, and you can find resources blueprint1543.org.
Nice. And guys, as you probably know, starting tomorrow, we will be back with our SG Drive-In. We're doing a special Halloween run. So tune back in tomorrow on Fridays, the next few weeks up until the day of Halloween, or right the Friday before Halloween. We will be doing these. Lots of good movies in the lineup, so tune in for that. Of course, if you want us to geek out on something you've been geeking out on, same website, you can go over there, give us a recommendation, or just ask us what we're geeking out on. We'll give you just a list of things to consume. And of course, we need you guys to remember that we are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests. This was an Anazao Ministries podcast. If you enjoyed this show and would like to learn more about our network, be sure to check out the Anazao Ministries podcast network.